The first sign that the ground was hiding a secret came as a sound, a hollow thud beneath the iron shoes of a plough horse. The tenant farmer reined in, thinking he'd struck an old stump. But when the soil caved and the animal's forelegs sank to the knee, he saw the squared corner of worked wood break through the loam. He fetched a spade, levered back the lid, and stared into a box built for silence. Inside lay a human skeleton, long bones the color of old straw, a skull fissured by violence. Not a pioneer's relic, not a family burial. This was a coffin without a name and without a prayer, interred not in the order of grief, but in the method of concealment. By dusk, men from the nearest magistrate stood in the furrow with lanterns and notebooks, and word ran ahead of them like brushfire. The Johnson's Crossroads place was full of the dead. In the days that followed, spades turned more earth. Another box and then another. An adult, a child, then two more small frames threaded with rusted chain. The pattern was unmistakable. Not misadventure, not fever. Murder laid out like ledger entries. And with every box opened, a name floated back from gossip to fact. Martha Patty Cannon. To outsiders, the borderland where Delaware melts into Maryland looked like a quiet republic of pine and sand. Few neighbors, fewer questions. Locals called this fork of roads Johnson's Crossroads, a scatter of farms stitched together by cart tracks and the slow black ribbon of the Nanticoke. But geography did more here than shape the map. It shaped the law. A man could stand in one room and belong to Delaware, then step through a door jamb and be in Maryland, leaving a sheriff and his warrant on the other side of a plank wall. It was the sort of place where a tavern could swap sovereignties between the front step and the back hallway, and where a criminal with a head for angles could convert miles of marsh and paper thin jurisdictions into profit. Patty Cannon did more than that. She turned this crossroads into a machine. She did not begin as a legend. Records, where they exist at all, suggest a woman born around 1760, perhaps Lucretia Patricia Hanley, perhaps somewhere farther north than Delaware, perhaps arriving in the region as a teenager, with more nerve than fortune. She married Jesse Cannon, farmed a little land straddling the border, raised at least one daughter, and gave their neighbors nothing worth remembering, until they did. After Jesse's suspicious death around 1826, poison, some would whisper, Patty stood alone at the threshold of a craft she had been practicing in pieces, kidnapping free black men, women and children, and selling them south into cotton, cane and silence. The timing favored her. After Congress ended the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, the domestic market fattened. Cotton boomed. Land spread west like a promise, and planters from Georgia to Mississippi paid dearly for bodies. In the Delmarva Peninsula, Delaware and the Maryland counties that hem it, free black communities had taken root after the Revolution. They labored, worshipped, married, and moved with papers that said they were free. Those papers meant little in the mouth of a river at midnight. Cannon's early methods borrowed from the traveling trades. A blacksmith's son-in-law, Henry Breton or Britain, shod horses by day and scouted by night, noting families with a strong son, a clever daughter, or a boy restless for wages. A second son-in-law, Joseph Johnson, brought money and the sort of pragmatism that turns crime into business. He also brought a tavern planted astride the state line, rooms laid like playing cards across two jurisdictions, a bar where a man could sign a bill in Delaware and settle the debt in Maryland without moving his stool. Above-ground travelers drank, haggled, and slept. Below, the beams were thick, the doors were meant to disappear into walls, and the stone held iron rings at ankle height. What grew around Patty was not a family so much as an organization. White thieves, mixed-race decoys with a dozen names. Men enslaved and coerced into betraying their own or face shipments south themselves. They wore respectability in daylight, aprons, aproned wives, a forge, a ledger, and hunted under cover of employment offers, a harvest in Georgia, carpentry in Carolina, wages paid on arrival. Once the wagon rolled, the job evaporated. The papers did too. At Johnson's Crossroads, identities were scraped clean. New names were assigned that matched sales receipts and bills of sale. Resistance brought the stick. Insistence on freedom brought the grave. The farmer's discovery in 1829 did not begin the story. It only forced it into daylight. By then, the gang's crimes stretched back nearly 2 decades. A Georgia trader, Bell or Miller accounts conflict, had come north years earlier with cash enough to buy a dozen people. He drank at the Cannon House and never left it alive. Others vanished along the same route, men with money stuffed into saddlebags and purchase lists folded in their coat pockets. Those deaths mattered to the outside world because they were white and wealthy, and missing money had voices that were heard. The black families who vanished, teenagers lured from Philadelphia streets, mothers and their children waylaid on country lanes, left smaller ripples on official paper. Patty counted on that. She also counted on fear. Neighbors saw wagon wheels at odd hours. Merchants asked no questions about payment. A sheriff trailed rumors until the county line swallowed his authority. Even the forest seemed to conspire, pines tight enough to cancel a cry, marsh grass that swallowed footprints, the Nanticoke running dark to the Chesapeake and beyond. And still, the boxes kept rising from the soil. Lantern light turned the furrows into a ledger. Here a chest custom built to the length of a man. There a smaller one fitted too neatly to be an accident of wood. In one pit, chains told their own story long after flesh had vanished. Each grave sat not where grief would have placed it, but where a plan had dictated. Out of sight, within reach, on land controlled by a woman who knew the ground as well as any surveyor. The regularity of it chilled even the hardened men sent to dig. This was not panic. This was policy. News carried fast across a peninsula that pretended to be slow. In Philadelphia, Mayor Joseph Watson, staunch Quaker, relentless opponent of kidnapping, had been mapping disappearances for years, his lines converging again and again on the Delaware-Maryland border. In Georgetown, Delaware's legal officers weighed what had long been whispered. In Caroline and Dorchester counties, Maryland's sheriffs stared at warrants that dissolved at doorways. Now at last, Earth and Bone had granted them something more than rumor. What the farmer had uncovered in that flooded-out corner of field was not just a body. It was the key to a locked room. Behind that door stood a tall woman with a hard voice and a business model, a tavern cut in half by a border, and a network that ran, quiet as river water, from northern streets to southern auctions. The chest in the furrow made it all visible. By sunset on the third day, the crossroads felt different. The tavern stood exactly where it had stood before. The pines whispered the same as they always had. But the illusion that this was only another thin place on the map had been broken. The men with shovels had touched the machinery beneath the soil. And the name that neighbors once mouthed only in kitchens and barns, Patty Cannon, was now spoken in courtrooms and city halls. The field closed in darkness. The lanterns went out. The boxes, tagged and logged, waited under guard. Somewhere downriver, the Nanticoke poured into the Chesapeake, carrying away a century of silt and secrets. For the first time, the current was turning. The crossroads did not make Patty Cannon. It simply gave her a stage. What turned rumor into revenue was structure, rooms, routes, roles, and a discipline that made cruelty efficient. The house came first. It was an ordinary two-story frame to the eye, clapboards weathered to gray, small windows, a kitchen that sweated in summer. But under the floorboards the plan revealed itself. The cellar walls were thick and low, fitted with iron rings sunk into stone at intervals that matched a man's stride. A trap panel in the pantry widened into a stair that no guest would find without instruction. When the wind blew from the marsh, it swallowed sound. Above ground, the front room held a Bible, a clock, and a shaving mirror. Below, the dark held people. A mile away, the tavern completed the design. Joseph Johnson's place sat directly on the surveyor's arithmetic, front door in Delaware, back passage in Maryland. The barroom carried the noise that made lawmen comfortable, dice clacking, mugs striking wood, card corners lifted with a thumbnail. Behind the bar hung a ledger and the usual notices. Behind the notices, a narrow door cut to disappear in lamplight. Rooms upstairs were let to travelers. Rooms beneath were not let at all. They were kept. Patty's organization divided labor like any other cash business. Scouts were the point of sale. Men with ordinary reasons to knock on doors. Gay blacksmith like Henry Britton, her first son-in-law, could ride a circuit to service a forge and memorize names. Peter the cooper, with strong hands. Eliza with 2 boys, one near man-height, a father out of work since winter. A mixed-race decoy such as John Purnell could drift between communities with less alarm, talk wages and travel, make an offer that sounded like Providence. Wagoners moved what the ledgers called loads. Guards watched the night. Patty kept the accounts and set the rules. The pitch rarely needed force at the start. In Philadelphia, Wilmington, and the small markets that dotted the peninsula, honest jobs were scarce and promises were plentiful. A man with soft shoes and a clean coat could stand outside a church and hire half a day's hope by sundown. Georgia needs hands, rail fencing and ditching. Pay on arrival, food on the road. The mark climbed in, thinking of wages. Somewhere south of Christiana, the talk turned to papers, then to, you'll get them signed in Dover, then to a blindfold, because of thieves. By the time the wagon crossed the Nanticoke, the bargain had been rewritten without ink. At Johnson's Crossroads, the machine processed people like freight. Names were stripped first. Freedom papers, if any, were burned in a stove old enough to hide its appetite. New names were assigned that matched bills of sale waiting downriver. A story was issued with each: birthplace, previous owner, reason for sale. Resistance drew a stick, but indifference cut deeper. The point was not to break a body. It was to erase a history. Lydia Smith's account, preserved later in court papers, reads like a ledger of terror. 25 free taken on a road near Philadelphia. She was moved from Cannon's house to Johnson's Tavern and kept 5 months in rotation, chained at the ankle. Fed by measure, told the date she'd be shipped with a batch. She remembered the smell of damp pine, the way the candlelight faltered before it reached the eyes of the people beside her, the silence that followed any plea that began with, "I have papers." When Watson's men pried her out of that place, they carried not only a woman but evidence, details of rooms, of doors, of voices, of names that matched other disappearances, profit-determined policy. After 1808, a healthy young adult could fetch 3 and sometimes 4 figures in southern markets. Children less, but they carried decades of labor and little chance of rebellion. The gang adjusted to demand. Boys just past childhood were prized. Girls who could cook or sew were inventoried as house. Infants complicated transport. If a mother was strong and docile, the child might be kept. More often, Patty counted the cost and chose the cheaper arithmetic. Cyrus James, enslaved in her household and forced to serve as decoy, would later testify to choices that only business could explain and only cruelty could carry out. Rivalry was a second income stream and a rising risk. Slave traders from the South traveled north with cash in saddlebags and lists of likely Negroes to buy lawfully from local owners. They were competition and target. The method with them was hospitality turned knife. A trader, Bell or Miller by different tellings, drank at the Cannon place and bragged with the ease of men who think the room is theirs. He ate, he slept, he did not wake. His horse showed up in Patty's possession. His money did not. It was not an isolated episode. When Britton and Joseph Griffith killed a man called Rigel at Cannon's house in 1813, the motive was simple: empty his purse, seize his property, erase the witness. Britton and Griffith swung at Georgetown. Patty did not. Britton's hanging clarified the business rather than curbed it. If a crude robbery drew a gallows, then the remedy was not virtue but sophistication. Joseph Johnson brought that to the partnership. He knew the timing of riverboats, the appetites of auctioneers, and the price of a sheriff's delay. He could move a wagon at dusk and arrange for it to meet a sloop by moonrise, the horses' hooves muffled with burlap and their mouths tied with twine. He could convert coin into silence and silence into time. Time is what the borders gave them. A warrant in Delaware died on a Maryland doorstep. A constable in Maryland could not cross into Delaware without making an enemy of a neighbor. If a deputy found a door in the tavern that seemed thinner than it should be, he had to ask in the right county to open it. Most did not. The ones who pressed were offered ale and gossip about a horse race. They left empty-handed and a little flattered. The machine kept turning. Not everyone looked away. In Philadelphia, Mayor Joseph Watson pinned red marks on a map, each a person gone missing. The pins clustered southward. He sent letters to sheriffs who replied with shrugs, and to governors who replied with courtesy. He raised reward money, not enough to buy a gang, but enough to make a disgruntled teamster think about his conscience and his purse at the same time. Names began to leak out: Cannon, Johnson, Purnell, the Crossroads. The tavern on the line. Closer to Patty, the neighborhood learned its own calculus. A merchant who sold pork to the tavern asked no questions about where coin came from. Coin spent the same. A farmer who heard a wagon at midnight told himself it was just a delivery from Blades. A mother who warned her boy not to take work from a stranger kept him by her side when he bristled. Fear is a kind of labor, too. The county did its share. Inside the house, Cyrus James grew from child to tool to witness. Bought young, kept closer than a hired man and farther than kin, he ran errands that stitched him into the crime. Stand by the road and look tired. Speak to a man in a city and mention work. Carry a jug into a room where a trader counted money out loud. He learned Patty's voice, how it flattened when she calculated, how it rose when crossed. He learned that kindness arrived only as strategy, and that every favor carried a hook. He learned the ground, where the soil was sandy enough to dig fast, where water pooled after rain, where a chest could sit for a decade and still be found whole. The machine had rules that sounded like superstition, but worked like procedure. Never move a chained person in daylight, unless the wagon boards are high. Always strip papers and burn them in the kitchen stove, where ash looks like any other. Never sell too many to one buyer in 1 week. Even men who buy people notice patterns. If the ink stacks high in a single ledger, keep the tavern noisy at dusk. Fiddles, dice, arguments over horses, so that nobody asks what happens when the noise stops. By the early 1820s, the system threw off money and enemies in equal measure. A trader vanished, and his partners asked questions with letters that had seals on them. A boy escaped and described a door with a nail driven crooked at eye level. A woman in Philadelphia named Lydia named rooms and voices and a stair that groaned, and when Watson sent a man to listen, the stair groaned on cue. The border that had protected Patty began to attract attention rather than dissolve it, and then the ground itself chose a side. The winter of 1828 broke dry. Spring came with less rain than memory promised. The low field behind a tenant's plot firmed up enough to take a plough. A horse put its weight into the collar and dropped a leg into a void cut to coffin shape. The box that rose from that furrow carried not just bones but a message. The machine had always had a failure mode, and time had found it. What followed would be coordination that the region had never seen. Sheriffs speaking across lines. Warrants stitched to each other, so that a door could be opened regardless of which side its hinges faced. A young man named Cyrus asked a question, and for the first time answering it. The lanterns had already shown the pattern in the dirt. The law was about to see the blueprint. When the sheriff's men came to Johnson's Crossroads in the spring of 1829, they expected resistance. Guns, dogs, a barricaded door. What they found instead was a silence so deliberate it sounded rehearsed. The tavern's shutters were latched from within, the barroom dust thick with months of disuse. No smoke curled from cannon's chimney. Only one person remained to answer their questions, a young mixed-race man of about 20, his wrists marked by old iron, his eyes older still. His name was Cyrus James, and he carried in his memory the anatomy of a kingdom built on blood. The child in chain Cyrus had been 7 when Patty Cannon bought him. He remembered only fragments of the auction, heat, flies, a voice calling numbers. Patty saw more than a child that day. She saw a tool. In the Cannon household he became part errand boy, part decoy, part witness to what no child should learn. She taught him obedience through alternating kindness and cruelty, feeding him biscuits one day and reminding him of the whip the next. He grew up hearing the cries beneath the floorboards, the sounds of boots dragging weight down the cellar stairs. Sometimes Patty would order him to carry food to the captives, other times to watch the road for strangers. Every command was an initiation, each task designed to bind him to her world of secrecy. "You belong to me," she would say, "and you'll do what I tell you, if you want to live." In time, Cyrus learned not to ask questions, but he remembered everything. The faces of travelers who arrived and never left, the smell of rum and gunpowder on the nights when laughter turned to violence, the exact places where the earth had been freshly turned behind the house. A servant turned decoy. When he reached 15, Patty decided he was old enough to earn his keep. She trained him to lure the unwary, other young black men walking alone, free but poor, searching for work. "You talk to them," she instructed, "because they'll believe you faster than they'll believe a white man." And so Cyrus became the bait. He'd approach strangers on the road with a smile and the promise of wages. There's work at the crossroads, good pay, easy labor. Miss Patty will feed you first." Many followed, grateful for the kindness of a familiar face. Few ever returned. Each success earned him brief praise, but guilt gnawed at him in the dark. He'd sit by the kitchen hearth listening to muffled weeping below, knowing that his words had delivered another soul to chains. The duality tore him apart. Fear of Patty's rage on one side, horror at what he'd become on the other. One night, he tried to free a captive boy no older than himself. He stole the cellar key and crept down with trembling hands, but the lock screamed metal against metal, and before the door could open, Patty was there, lantern raised, her face half shadow, half fire. She beat him senseless and left him bleeding beside the very door he had tried to open. "You're mine," she hissed, "and don't forget it." From that night on, Cyrus never tried to resist again, but he watched, the breaking point. By the mid-1820s, the atmosphere in the Cannon household had changed. The walls themselves seemed tired from holding secrets. Patty grew paranoid, convinced that someone would betray her. Her temper sharpened with age. She lashed out at her accomplices, even family. Cyrus witnessed horrors that etched themselves into his soul. One evening, a child in Patty's custody fell ill. Rather than risk discovery by calling a doctor, she wrapped the feverish body in her apron and carried it outside. The child was never seen again. Another time, she accused a woman of plotting escape and struck her down with a fireplace poker. Cyrus was forced to dig the grave. Fear had long since burned out of him, replaced by a numb resolve. He began to note details, how deep each grave was dug, how long it took the smell to fade, the rhythm of wagons that came at night and left before dawn. Every memory became a record, though he had no idea that one day those records would free him. The arrest when lawmen finally returned to the crossroads after the grisly discovery in the field, Patty was gone. Some said she had fled south to join her son-in-law, Joseph Johnson. Others believed she was still nearby, hidden in one of her secret rooms. The search yielded nothing until they found Cyrus. He did not resist when the sheriff's deputy bound his hands. Perhaps he was relieved it was over. Brought to Georgetown for questioning, he said little at first. The officers saw only another suspect, a colored youth tied to a murderous gang. But when he was shown the wooden chests dug from the ground, when he saw what had become of those he'd once tried to help, something in him broke open. "I'll tell you," he whispered. "I'll tell you everything. Confession." The confession lasted 2 days. Cyrus spoke in the steady tone of someone too exhausted for lies. He described the murders of the traders, the kidnapping routes, the hidden chambers beneath the tavern. He led investigators to burial sites they hadn't yet uncovered, each exactly where he said it would be. He named names: Joseph Johnson, Ebenezer Johnson, John Purnell, and Patty herself. He recounted the killing of the Georgia slave trader who had been buried in a chest, the murders of children too young to survive the journey south, and the practice of selling captives across the Mason-Dixon line as escaped property. The men who listened, sheriffs, magistrates, lawyers, wrote furiously, their pens trembling. None had imagined the scale of the operation or the depth of its cruelty. By the end, Cyrus's words filled a sheaf of paper that would later form the backbone of the state's indictment against Patty Cannon. A witness and a weapon. For the first time in his life, Cyrus's knowledge gave him power. The men who had arrested him now treated him with a strange respect, half pity, half awe. He was both criminal and victim, enslaved participant and key witness. Without him, they could prove little. With him, they could unravel a decade of murder. He guided the searchers back to the Cannon property. In the garden, they found the small grave he had dug years earlier, a mixed-race child, buried shallow, bones delicate as bird wings. Then 2 boxes side by side, each containing skeletons of children. Cyrus wept when they unearthed them, naming one as the boy he had tried to save long ago. The sheriff who led the excavation later wrote, "It was the testimony of that poor, colored youth that showed us the devil's footprint upon this land. The fall of the crossroads. With every body raised, the legend of Patty Cannon's terror collapsed into fact. The tavern was stripped, its cellars exposed. Iron rings, chains, and scraps of fabric still bound to bone were displayed before a grand jury that could no longer pretend ignorance. Newspapers called it the reverse Underground Railroad, and for the first time, white authorities admitted that free black citizens had been stolen into slavery by their own countrymen. But for Cyrus, vindication brought no peace. He had lived too long inside the machinery he had helped maintain. Every night in the jail, he heard again the muffled sobs from beneath the floorboards. Every dawn he wondered whether Patty, somewhere still alive, would send someone to silence him. When his testimony concluded, the court granted him protection and, eventually, freedom. It was the first act of mercy he had ever known from the law. A witness to history, years later, abolitionists would speak of Cyrus James as a living archive, the boy who remembered everything. Some said he went north to Pennsylvania under a new name and worked quietly with the Underground Railroad, turning knowledge once used for evil toward salvation. But on that spring morning in 1829, standing amid the open graves and the smell of damp earth, he was simply a man who had seen too much. He looked down at the bones lifted from their boxes and said, "She made me help her. I can't help them now." And with those words, the reign of Patty Cannon began to crumble. By the summer of 1829, the name Patty Cannon had become synonymous with terror. Across Delaware and Maryland, whispers moved faster than truth, stories of buried chests, missing children, and the woman who ruled the border like a queen of shadows. But beneath the gossip was a machinery of crime that had operated for nearly 20 years. Hidden in plain sight and protected by a system too blind or too indifferent to see the human lives it devoured. The woman behind the monster. Before she was America's most feared woman. Martha Patty Cannon was simply another farmer's wife. Born around 1760, she had lived through the Revolution, the birth of a nation and the rise of slavery as its unspoken engine. She understood power early, not the kind written into law, but the kind that grew from fear, rumor, and money. Neighbors remembered her as tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that could silence a room. Her hands were large and calloused, her gaze direct enough to make men look away. She was no ordinary woman of her era. She drank whiskey from a jug, cursed like a sailor, and fought any man who questioned her. You could see in her face, one farmer later recalled, that she believed she was born to command. Patty had no moral compass beyond profit. To her, people were inventory, tools to be used, traded, or buried as circumstance demanded. Her intelligence was cold and practical, the kind that could organize murder with the efficiency of a merchant drawing up a shipment list. The reverse Underground Railroad, the slave trade, had been outlawed from Africa, but not from America itself. Cotton was gold and every bale demanded hands to pick it. When supply faltered, men like Patty Cannon stepped into the void. She built what historians would later call the reverse Underground Railroad, a system that ran north to south, stealing the free and selling them back into bondage. Her network stretched from Philadelphia's back alleys to the slave markets of Alabama and Mississippi. In northern cities, agents scouted potential victims, free black men with limited proof of status, single women traveling alone, even children playing near docks. Once captured, victims were moved south through secret routes that mirrored those used by abolitionists, except in reverse. At the heart of this machine stood Johnson's Tavern, the headquarters of Patty's criminal empire. Travelers saw a place of cheap ale and warm food. Insiders knew it as a depot for human cargo. Beneath its floors ran tunnels and false rooms built with the precision of a military fort. Iron rings embedded in stone walls marked where captives had been chained. Even the layout of the building, half in Delaware, half in Maryland, was a legal trick designed to confuse any sheriff who came knocking. Partners in crime Patty rarely worked alone. Her circle included her son-in-law, Joseph Johnson, a smooth-talking trader with connections across the Deep South. He managed logistics, wagons, bills of sale, buyers, and corrupt officials willing to look the other way. His brother Ebenezer handled transport, guiding chained captives along forest trails toward ships waiting on the Nanticoke River. Mixed-race decoys like John Purnell played another role. They infiltrated black communities under false pretenses, offering work or passage to relatives in the South. Once trust was gained, the victims vanished. Some decoys were willing criminals. Others were coerced by threats of being sold themselves. Even enslaved people were forced to betray their own under Cannon's command. Those who disobeyed were beaten or disappeared entirely. It was a web of power built on terror and silence, with Patty at its cold center, issuing orders, counting coins, and deciding who lived long enough to serve her profits. Murder as policy. When the reverse Underground Railroad began attracting unwanted attention, Patty adjusted her business model. The rule was simple: no loose ends. Rival traders who passed through her territory carrying cash became customers of the tavern and never left alive. The first known case was a slave trader named Rigel, who stopped at the tavern in 1813. He drank with Patty's men, fell asleep drunk and woke only to a pistol shot. His killers, Britton and Griffith, were hanged, but Patty escaped justice. She had planned the murder, yet left no trace that could tie her directly to it. Over time, these killings became routine. White traders, black victims, even members of her own gang. Anyone who posed a threat was eliminated. She called it cutting losses. When the earth behind her tavern grew crowded with bodies, she simply buried them deeper. The silence of the counties, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Patty Cannon's reign, was not her cruelty, but the indifference that allowed it. In the early 1800s, free black citizens had few legal protections. They could not testify against white defendants, vote, or rely on law enforcement. Their disappearances rarely warranted investigation. Meanwhile, the border itself provided a perfect smokescreen. Delaware sheriffs had no power once a fugitive crossed into Maryland, and Maryland officials cared little for crimes committed outside their own county. Jurisdiction ended where Patty's land began. The few who dared to speak were silenced. A free man named Thomas Freeman escaped her gang in 1827 after realizing the job offer he'd accepted was a trap. When he later testified, his words matched Cyrus James's account nearly detail for detail. But before the investigation could reach court, several of Freeman's companions vanished without a trace. For nearly 2 decades, the Cannon-Johnson ring operated under this cloak of confusion, kidnapping the free, murdering the inconvenient, and selling human lives like livestock. The beginning of the end by 1828, Patty Cannon's empire had grown too large to remain invisible. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a devout Quaker and fierce abolitionist, began tracing the disappearances of free black citizens from his city. The trails always ended near the Delaware-Maryland line. Watson's investigation connected dozens of missing persons to the same region, Johnson's Crossroads. When he offered a $500 reward for information, tongues that had long been silent began to move. Former gang members and terrified locals whispered the same name. Pressure mounted. Sheriffs from Sussex County and Dorchester County began cooperating, sharing information across state lines for the first time. They spoke with escaped captives who described the same rooms, the same tunnels, the same woman. Meanwhile, Patty's paranoia deepened. She stopped sleeping through the night, pacing her floorboards like a caged beast. She accused her own men of plotting against her. The tavern grew quiet. Wagons left half full. Fear had always been her weapon, but now it turned inward. The field gives up its dead. The first grave was found by accident, a horse's hoof cracking through rotted wood. The second was found hours later. By the end of the week, 7 bodies had been uncovered, each in a chest built to the same dimensions. Authorities descended on the property, armed not just with shovels, but with a name. They brought Cyrus James with them, and under his direction unearthed more than evidence. They unearthed proof of evil, refined into routine. Word spread quickly. Papers from Philadelphia to Richmond ran headlines like "The Female," "Monster of Delaware," and the "Woman Who Sold Men's Souls." Crowds gathered at the courthouse in Georgetown to glimpse the infamous murderess when she was finally captured. What they found was not a ghost or a witch, but a gray-haired woman with iron in her spine and no remorse in her eyes. The queen in her cell when questioned, Patty Cannon showed no fear. "You can hang me if you like," she reportedly told one officer. "I never did anything that others wouldn't have done for a profit." Her words chilled even hardened lawmen. She spoke of killings the way a merchant might speak of trade, practical, emotionless, inevitable. The law was finally closing in, but even from her cell she held the power of fascination. By the time her trial approached in May 1829, 4 indictments for murder had been filed against her. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses like Cyrus James and Thomas Freeman had destroyed the silence that once protected her. For the first time, Delaware was prepared to execute a white woman for crimes against black victims, but history would not grant the court that satisfaction. Patty Cannon would decide her own ending. The courthouse in Georgetown, Delaware, was never meant to hold a crowd like that. By the second week of May 1829, people poured into the square. Farmers from Sussex County, newspapermen from Philadelphia, even curious onlookers from as far south as Virginia. They came not out of justice but curiosity. The woman at the center of it all, Martha Patty Cannon, had become a living legend of evil. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The sheriff's men reinforced the jail with iron locks and posted armed guards at the door. Everyone knew she wouldn't escape again. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with tension. And yet, when she appeared in court for the first time escorted by deputies, her face betrayed nothing. She did not shuffle like a prisoner. She walked like she was entering her own parlor. The indictment on April 13, 1829, a grand jury of 24 white men had formally indicted Patty Cannon on 4 counts of murder. It was a list of crimes drawn from nightmares. The murder of an infant girl on April 26, 1822, the murder of a male child on the same date, the murder of a grown man on October 1, 1820, the murder of a young boy on June 3, 1824. Each charge carried the death penalty. For the first time in Delaware's history, a white woman stood accused of killing both black children, and white traders alike, a crime that forced the state to acknowledge horrors it had ignored for decades. At the prosecution's table sat Attorney General James Rogers, a man known for his precision and calm fury. He viewed this trial as more than punishment. It was a reckoning for the entire system that had let Cannon's gang thrive. At the defense table, no family sat behind her. Her daughters had vanished. Their husbands fled to the deep south. She had outlived every ally. The evidence against her was overwhelming and meticulously catalogued. There were the wooden chests unearthed from her property, each fitted exactly to a human form. There were the iron rings bolted into the cellar stones of Johnson's Tavern, still bearing traces of rusted chains. There were personal effects, buttons, scraps of fabric, and broken jewelry found buried alongside the remains. But above all, there was the voice of one man, Cyrus James, the enslaved boy who had grown up in her household and turned witness against her. When Cyrus entered the courtroom, silence fell. He stood trembling but resolute, the only living witness to years of murder and kidnapping. He pointed to her across the room and said simply, "That woman made me help her bury the dead." He described in chilling detail the night a Georgia trader had been shot while eating supper at Cannon's house, how Patty had ordered his body placed in a box, nailed shut, and buried beneath her garden. He recounted how she killed children born to enslaved women to save expense, as she'd said, and how she laughed afterward, claiming the dead wouldn't tell tales. The courtroom listened in stunned silence. Even those who had come for spectacle now stared at her, as though seeing death itself wearing a human face. The woman without remorse, Patty Cannon, never once cried. When the indictment was read, she smirked. When Cyrus spoke, she watched him with cold amusement. When witnesses described the graves, she interrupted only to correct them. It wasn't behind the barn. It was nearer the oak tree. Reporters later wrote that her composure was so unnatural as to suggest the absence of a soul. She told the jailer one night, "If I had to do it again, I'd run the business better." To the end, she believed what she had done was business, profitable, necessary, and inevitable in a world that valued gold above life. The jailhouse confessions while awaiting trial, Patty spoke more freely than anyone expected. She seemed to enjoy the attention, spinning half-truths and boasts to the guards. She confessed to more than 24 murders, though she could no longer recall every name. Some she claimed had disappeared south, others she admitted were buried where the field dips. She even mocked the officials who now guarded her. "You men think yourselves righteous," she told one constable. "But you bought the very people I sold." The irony was bitter and unanswerable. The spectacle of evil crowds gathered outside the Georgetown jail every morning just to glimpse her through the barred window. Mothers held up their children to see the witch of the border. Preachers thundered about divine retribution, while taverns nearby served whiskey in mugs stamped Patty's Hellfire. The newspapers printed every detail, turning her crimes into grisly entertainment. The Delaware Gazette called her the Medusa of the Mason-Dixon line. The Philadelphia Inquirer described her as a woman of monstrous vitality, half man, half demon. But to those who had lived near Johnson's Crossroads, the spectacle cut deeper. They had known her, bought from her, eaten at her table. Now they realized that every night of laughter in her tavern had masked screams below their feet. The morning of May 11th, 1829, the trial was set to begin the following week. The gallows was already being built outside Georgetown. But before justice could claim her, Patty Cannon claimed herself. That morning, guards found her lying on the stone floor of her cell, her lips blue, her hand clutching a small glass vial. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as arsenic poisoning. No one knew how she had obtained it. Some believed a sympathizer smuggled it in. Others whispered that she'd hidden poison in her hair comb weeks before. Her death was swift, deliberate, and denied the state the satisfaction of execution. When the news reached the courthouse steps, the crowd erupted, not in mourning but in frustration. Justice, they said, had been cheated. The burial of a legend, Patty Cannon's body, was buried without ceremony in the Georgetown jail yard under a plain marker. Officials feared her grave would become a spectacle, but it didn't matter. People came anyway. They chipped pieces from the stone, told stories about her ghost walking the fields at night, or about the cries that could still be heard beneath the tavern floor. Years later, when the jail was torn down, her bones were moved to a pauper's field. Her skull, separated from her body, traveled through museums and libraries as a morbid curiosity, a relic of evil that refused to stay buried. The aftermath, with Patty dead, her criminal empire collapsed. Joseph Johnson and his brother Ebenezer fled into the Deep South, never to be captured. The tavern at Johnson's Crossroads rotted into ruin. The community renamed the area Reliance, trying to erase its infamy. But the stain remained. Cyrus James, the boy who had been both prisoner and witness, was granted freedom for his cooperation. He disappeared quietly to Pennsylvania, where abolitionists helped him build a new life. Some say he later worked with the Underground Railroad, guiding others to freedom through routes that once led to captivity. Legacy of the Border. Which Patty Cannon's story became folklore, twisted, exaggerated, sometimes romanticized, but its truth was darker than any legend. She was not a myth or a monster born of fantasy. She was a human being who exploited the flaws of a nation still learning what freedom meant. Her life revealed a terrible paradox, that within a young America built on liberty, there could exist an empire of slavery sustained by greed, racism, and silence. As one newspaper wrote after her death, "She died unrepentant, but her memory will not die. For as long as men forget their humanity, another Patty Cannon may rise again." And so, with the turning of the century, her name faded from headlines but lingered in whispers. The woman who sold the free, killed the bound, and poisoned herself to escape the hangman's rope. By the summer of 1829, the earth along the Delaware-Maryland border had begun to yield its secrets. Each new grave unearthed on the old Cannon property turned rumor into evidence, silence into history. For decades, the land had hidden its dead beneath tobacco fields and pine roots, the crimes smothered by mud and time. Now, with Patty Cannon gone by her own hand, investigators dug through layers of soil and deception to uncover the full extent of her empire. The search that changed the law sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County led the effort. Aided by deputies from Maryland and agents dispatched by Governor John Andrew Schulzer of Pennsylvania. It was an unprecedented alliance. Never before had 3 states pooled resources to expose a single criminal enterprise. For the first time, the fractured justice of the 1820s began to act like a united force. They carried broad warrants, documents authorizing them to search any parcel connected to Cannon or her associates. The ink of those signatures was a quiet revolution. It meant the law had learned from its failure. The loopholes that had once shielded Cannon's crimes, those fragile borders that let her step between counties to vanish, were now being sewn shut. The first discoveries were predictable. Skeletal remains in boxes, rusted chains, fragments of clothing. But as the excavation widened, the evidence became stranger, almost ritualistic. Beneath the main hearth of Johnson's tavern, workers uncovered a cavity lined with oak planks, as if a coffin had been built into the very foundation of the house. Inside lay the remains of two adults, their bones arranged neatly side by side. A child's femur rested across their chests like a final warning. No one knew who they were. Perhaps travelers, perhaps accomplices who had outlived their usefulness. The only certainty was that Patty Cannon had made even her home complicit in her crimes. The evidence of a system forensic science, as we know it, did not exist in 1829. Yet even the crude tools of the era told a story. The bones bore marks of deliberate violence, fractures to skulls, blade indentations in ribs, wrists worn smooth from shackles. Many were found sealed in chests crafted to fit a human body exactly, nails driven in double rows to prevent the boards from warping. A doctor from Dover examining the remains remarked, "This was not accident nor passion, it was practice." These deaths were performed as by a hand accustomed to them. The more they found, the clearer the picture became. Patty Cannon's crimes had not been random acts of cruelty. They were an industry. The kidnapping, confinement, transport, and sale of free African Americans had been a logistical network spanning hundreds of miles and thousands of victims. For every grave discovered, there were dozens more unseen, people sold into slavery whose names vanished from census rolls, church books, and memory. The town that tried to forget. The citizens of Sussex County wanted the story to end quickly. Each revelation stained the soil they stood on. Georgetown's newspapers stopped printing the grisly details, and sermons turned from condemnation to silence. "Let the earth keep its shame," one pastor said. But silence had allowed the crimes to thrive once before, and the men who dug through that soil understood the danger of forgetting. When the bodies were finally removed, they were placed in plain pine coffins and buried again, this time in a communal grave outside the town limits. No markers, no prayers, only a single wooden post inscribed, "Unknown, freed by death." It was the only justice the dead would ever receive. The fate of the gang with their leader gone, the remnants of the Cannon-Johnson network scattered. Joseph Johnson, Patty's son-in-law, escaped to Alabama, where whispers placed him running slave auctions under a false name. His brother Ebenezer vanished into Mississippi, rumored to have resumed the trade with new partners. John Purnell, the mixed-race decoy who lured victims north, was captured briefly in Maryland, but disappeared before trial, likely silenced by those he once served. Only Cyrus James remained, alive but marked by what he had seen. His testimony had not only destroyed the gang, it had saved countless lives. Yet even in freedom, he carried the guilt of a boy forced to participate in atrocity. When abolitionist societies in Philadelphia learned of his role, they raised funds to resettle him under a new name in Pennsylvania. There, according to oral tradition, he joined the early Underground Railroad, using the same routes that had once carried captives south to now ferry them north to liberty. The irony was almost biblical. The paths of bondage turned to roads of salvation by the same boy who had once guided victims to their doom. Echoes in the courtroom. The official case of the state of Delaware versus Martha Cannon closed with her death, but the court transcripts circulated among lawmakers and reformers across the North. They revealed the moral rot that allowed such crimes to exist, not merely one woman's cruelty, but a society's complicity. In Philadelphia, Mayor Joseph Watson used the Cannon case to demand stronger laws protecting free black citizens from abduction. Within months, Pennsylvania expanded its personal liberty statutes, making kidnapping a capital offense. Even in Delaware, legislators were forced to confront what had festered within their borders. A new generation of judges argued that a justice system blind to race was not only possible but necessary. These were small steps, but history would later mark them as the early tremors of a coming storm, the abolitionist movement that would one day set the nation aflame. The ghosts of Reliance. When the investigations ended, Johnson's Crossroads, renamed Reliance, was left desolate. The tavern stood empty for years, its windows shattered by storms, its cellar collapsing inward as though the earth itself wanted it buried again. Travelers avoided the place, claiming to hear chains rattling under the floorboards or see lantern light flickering across the fields where no living soul walked. Old men told stories to frighten children of a woman's shadow on the road at dusk, of whispers that said names in the dark. "That's Patty," they'd mutter, still hunting for the ones who got away. But the truest hauntings were not ghosts. They were the scars left on the living. Families in Philadelphia and Baltimore who never found their missing sons. Mothers in Delaware who still left candles in windows. Decades after hope had died, history buried. Then dug again. By the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, Patty Cannon's name had faded into folklore, a monster's tale told by candlelight. Yet beneath the horror was truth. The reverse Underground Railroad she helped organize was real, and its victims numbered in the thousands. In the 20th century, when developers broke ground near the old jail in Georgetown, they found a skull believed to be hers. It was displayed in the Dover Public Library until the 1960s, a grim curiosity. Labeled the head of the murderess Patty Cannon, people gawked at it without realizing that the story it represented was not simply one woman's madness, but the nation's own reflection. The lesson of the graves, what the investigators of 1829 uncovered, went beyond bones. It revealed how cruelty becomes invisible when it profits the powerful. Patty Cannon thrived, not because she was cunning alone, but because her victims were poor black and legally voiceless. Her story forces an uncomfortable question. How many others like her operated, unrecorded, beneath the surface of early America? The graves behind her tavern offer a grim answer, enough to fill the silence of history. Closing lines, when the last shovelful of dirt covered the final coffin. Sheriff Houston stood beside the mound and removed his hat. "There's your border," he said quietly. "Not between states, but between good men and those who looked away." The others nodded, though no one spoke. Around them, the pines swayed in the evening wind, and somewhere in the distance, the Nanticoke River moved on, black-wide and indifferent, carrying with it the memory of the crimes that once stained its banks. The borderlands slept again, but the ground beneath never forgot. When the name Patty Cannon faded from the headlines, the world moved on. The tavern fell silent, the graves were covered, and the law congratulated itself for ending a reign of terror. But for those left behind, the families who lost fathers, daughters, brothers, and children, the nightmare didn't end. It simply vanished into the cracks of history, like the voices that had cried from beneath her floorboards. The story of Patty Cannon is not just one of evil, it is one of erasure, because the people she destroyed were the very people history refused to see. The vanished in the years following her death. Letters poured into Delaware and Maryland from cities across the North, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, each written in a trembling hand, each asking the same desperate question: "Did you find a boy named Samuel? Have you heard of a woman called Mary Ann taken from Wilmington?" My husband, Robert Carter, was free. He left home for work in 1825 and never returned. No one had answers. The graves yielded only bones, and bones had no names. The few survivors who escaped could remember faces, but not always the roads that had carried them to hell. Among the missing were children stolen from doorsteps, husbands abducted on their way to market, wives vanished while washing clothes near rivers. Their stories never made the papers. They belonged to the nameless, and in early America, the nameless had no history. Quaker abolitionist in Philadelphia recorded more than 70 cases of free black citizens disappearing between 1815 and 1828, all within routes leading south toward the Delmarva Peninsula. Historians now believe most of them were victims of the Cannon-Johnson network. Each disappearance was a thread, cut from the fabric of a fragile freedom. Voices, in the shadows of all the survivors whose testimonies reached paper, few were as haunting as that of Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old woman from Philadelphia who had been held captive in Cannon's tavern for 5 months. Lydia described hearing children cry in the dark, chained to the walls of the cellar. She told of mothers whispering lullabies until they were struck silent for making too much noise. There were nights, she recalled, when the singing stopped, and in the morning there were fewer of us. She remembered Patty Cannon's footsteps, heavy, certain, like she owned the earth, and her cold voice cutting through the dark. "Ain't no freedom here, child. The only way out is south." Lydia had been bound for Georgia when she was rescued by a patrol of investigators sent by Mayor Joseph Watson. The scars on her wrists never faded. Other survivors spoke too, though their names have mostly been lost. One man, recorded only as J.T. of Maryland, described being forced to march by night with 15 others toward a waiting sloop on the Nanticoke River. The weakest fell behind and were left by the roadside. When rescuers traced the route later, they found shallow graves where he said they would, the price of silence. The tragedy of the reverse Underground Railroad was not only the horror of what it did, but the silence that followed. For every official who investigated, 10 others preferred not to. Slave traders in the South were reluctant to question where their property came from. Northern officials feared disrupting trade or inflaming tensions between free and slave states. And so, the victims vanished twice, first from life, then from memory. In Georgetown, after Patty's suicide, the local papers quickly shifted tone. The Delaware Gazette ran a brief obituary calling her a woman of singular intelligence led astray by greed, as though she had been a victim of circumstance, not a predator of hundreds. The same paper never once published the names of her known victims. In nearby Caroline County, Maryland, residents petitioned to have the remains on Cannon's property reburied for the sake of decency and quiet. The request was granted, and within months, the site was leveled and fenced off. By 1830, new settlers had plowed fields over the graves, unaware or unwilling to know what lay beneath. The white community wanted peace. The black community wanted justice. What they got was forgetting. The cost to a people, for free African Americans across the mid-Atlantic, the Cannon affair became both a warning and a wound. In the wake of the trial, black families began forming vigilance committees, informal networks that patrolled roads, verified travel papers, and kept watch for suspicious wagons. Parents forbade their children from walking alone after dusk. Men carried their freedom certificates sewn into their clothing, afraid that the loss of a single paper could mean the loss of their life. One free black minister from Wilmington wrote in his diary, "We are hunted as beasts. The woman Cannon may be dead, but her shadow remains." This atmosphere of fear persisted for years, and even after slavery's abolition, the story of Patty Cannon lingered as a dark whisper in sermons and family tales. The woman history. Forgot to hate in the decades following her death, Patty Cannon transformed in the public imagination from a criminal into a grotesque legend. Cheap novels and pulp newspapers of the late 1800s painted her as a she-devil, a gothic villain who poisoned travelers and buried treasure with her victims. The horror of her actual crimes was replaced by superstition. By turning her into a caricature, society accomplished a subtle erasure. It made her evil feel unreal, distant, theatrical. The real horror, the systemic kidnapping and sale of free black citizens, was easier to dismiss as folklore. When novelist George Alfred Townsend published The Entailed Hat in 1884, he romanticized the events into melodrama, transforming Cannon into a villainess of adventure rather than atrocity. Readers thrilled at her cunning, not her cruelty. The truth was buried again, this time under fiction. The bones speak. Once more century later, in the 1960s, construction workers expanding the Georgetown courthouse unearthed old remains, bones yellowed by age, fragments of wood, rusted iron shackles. The discovery forced the state to reopen its archives, and researchers found the long-forgotten transcripts of her case. In a morbid twist, her skull, long separated from her body, was displayed in the Dover Public Library, labeled Patty Cannon, female serial murderer, till 1829. Visitors stared through glass at the hollow sockets of history. Children on school trips whispered that if you looked long enough the skull would grin. The exhibit was meant as cautionary history, but in truth, it was spectacle once again. The victims remained unnamed, unmarked, unremembered. The abolitionists' reminder in 1845. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass, himself a Maryland native, referenced the horrors of the reverse underground in a speech in New York. Though he never spoke Patty Cannon's name directly, his words echoed her legacy. It is not only the chains that bind the slave, but the laws that allow the free to be stolen. Evil thrives in the space where justice turns away her face. Douglass's words captured the deeper meaning of Cannon's crimes. They were not anomalies of a wicked woman, but symptoms of a nation's disease. the long shadow more than a century later, historians would uncover estimates suggesting that between 500 and 1,000 free African Americans were kidnapped and sold by networks like Cannon's during the early 19th century. Her gang may have been the most organized, but it was not unique. Each vanished name was a story untold, a life rewritten by violence. Their descendants, scattered through the Deep South, would never know their ancestors had once been free. In that sense, Patty Cannon's crime was not only murder, it was erasure of identity, a theft of generations. Memory and the mirror today, the small community of Reliance, Delaware, stands quiet where her tavern once did. A historical marker mentions her briefly, her crimes, her death, her infamy. It does not name a single victim. Tourists stop, read, and move on. Few realize that beneath their feet may still lie the bones of the stolen. The lesson of Patty Cannon's life is not about one woman's monstrosity. It is about what happens when a society decides whose pain is worth recording. She thrived because the world around her allowed it. She died because that world finally realized it could no longer look away. And the victims, those nameless souls who vanished into her wagons and into history, remain the truest ghosts of the border. Epilogue. Within a chapter in 1830, a year after her death, the Delaware legislature passed new measures tightening laws against kidnapping. It was progress, though too late for the hundreds already lost. In 2025, nearly 2 centuries later, historians still debate how many bodies lie unmarked in those fields. Locals still whisper of cries on the wind near the old crossroads. Perhaps they are only stories, or perhaps, as one historian wrote, history never stops speaking. We simply stop listening. For those who vanished under Patty Cannon's shadow, the wind over the pines remains their only voice. The dawn that broke over Johnson's Crossroads after Patty Cannon's death should have brought peace. The gallows were never used, the jail cell stood empty, and the newspapers declared her story finished. Yet the land did not rest. The crimes she committed and the silence that enabled them did not end with her poison. They lingered, festering in the soil in memory and in the nation's conscience. The world wanted closure. History, however, had other plans. The ghost in the courtroom. In the weeks after her death, officials gathered in Georgetown to close the record. The state of Delaware versus Martha Cannon was officially marked concluded. Her body lay buried behind the jail, her property seized and sold to pay debts. But the investigators who had seen the graves, the boxes, and the children's bones couldn't shake what they had uncovered. Sheriff Joseph Houston wrote in his final report, "The woman is dead, but the work of her hands remains alive. The soil she tilled with blood has no end to its yield." He was right. The case had revealed a larger truth. The reverse Underground Railroad wasn't confined to one woman's greed. It was a vast informal system stretching through states that claimed freedom while profiting from slavery. Patty Cannon had simply been its most ruthless architect. Her story forced America to look into a mirror it had spent decades avoiding. The invisible chain in the early 1830s. As Cannon's name faded, the trade she helped perfect continued under new hands. Slave traders still prowled the borders, stealing the free and selling them south. Kidnapping rings operated through Baltimore, Washington, and Norfolk, using forged papers and corrupt constables. The difference now was awareness. Abolitionists had learned from the Cannon case that evil thrived in isolation. They began building what she had unknowingly inspired, the opposite of her empire. Across Pennsylvania and New York, safe houses sprang up, homes with hidden cellars, secret tunnels, and coded lamps in windows. They called it the Underground Railroad, and some of the men who built it cited the Cannon affair as the moment they realized that law alone would not protect the innocent. The same soil that had swallowed her victims now gave rise to their deliverance. Cyrus James, the boy who lived no figure, embodied this transformation more than Cyrus James, the enslaved child who had become the state's key witness. After his testimony freed him, he disappeared into Pennsylvania under a new name. Records suggest he lived quietly at first, working for a Quaker family near Lancaster. But abolitionist journals from the 1840s mention a guide known only as CJ, who escorted fugitives through Delaware into freedom. Historians believe this was Cyrus, He had turned the same routes of terror, the river paths, the marsh roads, the hidden ferries, into passages of liberation. Where Patty Cannon once trafficked the free into chains, Cyrus led the enslaved into light. In his final years, he was said to have spoken of forgiveness, not vengeance. "The Lord let me live to undo what I was forced to do," he told one friend. "I was her instrument once, now I am his. No grave for him has ever been found, but in every tale of resistance whispered along the Mason-Dixon line, his shadow walks beside those who escaped." The changing tide by the mid-19th century, the story of Patty Cannon had evolved into folklore, a monster's tale told to children. But for abolitionists, she remained a symbol of the nation's hypocrisy. Pamphlets circulated by Quaker societies used her name to expose the moral decay of a country that preached liberty while buying stolen men and women. Ministers thundered from pulpits that the wages of silence are death. Writers drew parallels between Cannon's borderland and the fragile boundary between good and evil that the United States itself straddled. In truth, her legacy did more than horrify, it galvanized. Her crimes made it impossible for the North to claim innocence. Every free state that ignored the kidnappings was complicit. Every Southern buyer who looked the other way was her accomplice. Through this reckoning, the slow machinery of conscience began to turn. The legacy of the graves. When the Civil War erupted 3 decades later, soldiers marching through Delaware sometimes paused near Reliance, unaware they were treading over the same fields that had hidden Cannon's victims. Locals said the ground there was heavy, that no crops ever grew right. Farmers avoided plowing too deep. In 1890, a farmer unearthed another box while digging a new well. Inside were remains, small bones likely those of a child. The sheriff quietly reburied them without investigation. By then, people preferred their ghosts undisturbed, but the story refused to die. The woman in the museum in the 20th century. Historians rediscovered the records of her trial. Yellowed pages, brittle handwriting, and witness accounts that read like Gothic fiction, but were painfully real. They found her skull too, passed from one institution to another, displayed under glass as if evil could be reduced to anatomy. At the Dover Public Library in 1961, school children filed past the exhibit. Some laughed, some stared. The label beneath the skull read, "Patty Cannon, murderess of the reverse Underground Railroad." I asked who her victims were. It wasn't until the 1990s that scholars began reclaiming their stories, tracing census records, manumission papers, and runaway notices to reconstruct the human cost of her empire. Behind every statistic was a family. A blacksmith taken from Philadelphia, a young mother from Elkton, 2 brothers from Dover who vanished in 1827. Their names, once erased, began to reappear in print for the first time in nearly 2 centuries. The mirror of a nation, Patty Cannon's life remains one of America's most chilling paradoxes. She thrived not in a lawless wilderness, but in a country that called itself civilized. She was protected by lawmen, ignored by neighbors, and enriched by an economy that turned human beings into numbers. Her story reveals a brutal truth. Evil does not require chaos, it only requires consent. She was a woman who learned to weaponize every loophole the nation gave her. The divided borders, the racial laws, the apathy of those who saw suffering and called it none of my concern. In her reflection, America glimpsed its own contradictions, a republic preaching liberty while selling freedom by the pound. The quiet reckoning today, the town of Reliance, Delaware, stands as a quiet stretch of farmland, its roads renamed, its ghosts mostly unspoken. A historical marker near the site of Johnson's Tavern offers a few lines about the infamous slave trader Patty Cannon. It mentions her crimes, her arrest, and her suicide. It does not mention Cyrus James. It does not mention Lydia Smith. It does not mention the hundreds whose bones still lie beneath the soil. Visitors pass the sign in minutes, unaware that the air they breathe once carried the screams of the stolen. And yet, when night falls and the wind moves through the pines, locals still claim to hear faint echoes, chains rattling, a wagon's creak, a woman's laughter fading into silence. Perhaps it's superstition, or perhaps it's history reminding those who live here that the past never truly dies. It waits. Closing reflection. Patty Cannon's death by poison denied the gallows its spectacle, but not justice its purpose. The law learned from her, the abolitionists were strengthened by her exposure, and the conscience of a nation was forever marked by her deeds. The graves of her victims are unmarked, their names mostly lost, but their story endures, not in stone, but in the understanding that freedom, once stolen, must be guarded by all. The borderlands where she reigned have changed in name, but not entirely in nature. They remind us that cruelty grows best in the shadows between laws, between races, between what is known and what is ignored. Patty Cannon's empire of terror ended in 1829. The echoes of her crimes, however, continue to whisper a warning that every generation must hear. Evil begins in silence, and silence, once allowed to settle, can bury more than bodies. It can bury truth.